Actually got a stipend just for that.
I know.
Prize.
Finder's fee.
Yeah. Oh, of all things,
Are
that's
there
crazy.
like handouts we can have on the table?
Yeah, they're over.
My buddy's
No,
been
those
doing a lot
we
of
don't
work
have them.
across his house. He's
Okay.
got a house last year. He was digging out in the
okay.
lawn. He
Something
found these
different.
steps,
Okay.
like somehow like on the side of the
So we
house,
good?
but they
Are we good to go?
were kind of buried.
Really?
Yeah. He has a pool too that was buried. Like in the, they don't, haven't used it in years, obviously, but it's interesting how they.
Hello, everybody. My name is Dan Pasquarello. I'm the Vice Chair of the Planning Board. Thank you all for coming tonight to our informational session about the MBTA communities legislation. We know there's a lot of interest about this. We wanted to have public outreach for informational purposes and really to hear what everybody in town thinks as well, because that's going to be really helpful to us going forward. Before I introduce Margaret Hoffman, who's going to have the presentation for us tonight, I want to mention two main points off the top. One, this is a state mandate. This is passed into law. It's something that we are required to do as a town. And two, this is a zoning exercise. So you're going to hear numbers about how many units we have to zone for in order to be in compliance with the state legislation. That doesn't mean that we are building these units. It doesn't mean that these units necessarily will be built. But in order for us to come into compliance, we have to create certain zoning districts. So I think that's really important to keep in mind as we go through this, that this is, at root, a zoning exercise. So without further ado, we do not have a quorum for the planning board, so this is not a planning board meeting. So I'd like to introduce Margaret Hoffman.
Great, thank you, Dan. Thank you all for being here tonight. I'd like to introduce my colleague, Kate Mallory. Kate's our conservation coordinator, and we work together in the land use department. Kate works with the Conservation Commission and the Open Space Committee, and she does lots of wonderful work with trees. So if you have any interest in trees, contact Kate. I'd also like to introduce the MBTA working group. Rich Maloney, who's our building inspector and zoning enforcement officer. Joe Pesamato, who is our assistant town administrator. Dan Pasquarello, who is on the planning board, who you met. And Peter Clay, who is a planning board member as well as a select board member. I'm pleased to be presenting tonight on behalf of the Planning Board and the MBTA Working Group. This was formed by the Planning Board to research and work with the technical assistant consultant to develop a strategy for Wenham to deal with the new MBTA community regulations. Next slide. Thank you. So tonight we'll be giving you some information on tonight we'll be giving you the information that we've gained over the past months. We're going to talk about background. Why did Massachusetts pass this new law? Compliance, what does Wenham need to do to be in compliance, and what are the penalties for noncompliance? We have some facts about Wenham. We have state numbers for density and area. We're going to talk a little bit about zoning, what can we control. We have some information on our technical assistance. What help did we get this far, and what's available going forward? We're going to have a few scenarios that the consultant worked out. What areas are most suitable for compliance, and the next steps. What needs to be done, and when. Thank you. Do we need both of them? Oh, okay, good. So after we finish the presentation, we'll open up for questions, and we'll hopefully have some answers for you. Thank you.
To mention HWCAM.
Say that?
I forgot to mention
Oh, yes, sorry, we forgot to mention. This is being recorded and broadcast on HWCAM. The presentation will be available after, I think tomorrow or a couple of days, you'll be able to access it. There is no Zoom availability tonight, so it's just HWCAM. So the state of Massachusetts and Governor Charlie Baker passed the economic bond bill in 2020 in order to address, among other things, the housing crisis in Massachusetts. According to the Haley Driscoll administration, there's a need for at least 200,000 new units of housing in Massachusetts in order to meet expected demand by 2030. The state's designated 177 communities in Massachusetts as being some form of MBTA communities and are required to adhere to these guidelines. So these are the MBTA communities, and there are 4 designations. rapid transit, commuter rail community, adjacent community, and adjacent small town. Wenham is considered a commuter rail community. This means that we don't meet the criteria for a rapid transit community, and we have at least 100 acres of developable station area within the half mile of the train station. Wenham has, according to the state, 111 acres within its developable station area. More in-depth definitions of these categories can be found on the state's website, or if you want, you can contact me and I can send that information to you. So again, just to be clear, to reiterate what Dan said, this is a zoning exercise. Wenham is not responsible for creating any housing or funding any housing. We do have to create a district and zoning regulations that will allow for multifamily development by right. Currently in Wenham, Wenham is zoned 97% for single-family residential and 3% for business. We also have special permits to allow for some different types of housing now: senior living overlay district, flexible development regulations, and an independent living overlay district. More information on those can be found in our zoning bylaws too. Currently, Wenham is in compliance with the regulations. We submitted our action plan in January 2021. This was essentially a form that indicated that we're working towards compliance. Because we're a commuter rail community, we have until December of 2024 to have our zoning district and regulations in place. If we don't, we will not be eligible for these 3 funding programs: Mass Works, the Housing Choice Grants, Local Capital Projects Funds. Currently, Wenham doesn't participate in any of these programs. However, the state recently came out with an amendment that determined that several other grant programs will take into consideration compliance with MBTA communities when they're awarding these grants. Wenham has received funds from some of these. The ones in red are the ones I know about that we've received funds for. Okay, next slide. So these are some of the facts that we know about Wenham. Wenham is a commuter rail community. We have 1,460 existing housing units. The state's determined we have 111 developable station area acres. Our minimum compliance requirements are a total of a 24-acre district. We have to zone to allow for 365 units with a minimum gross average density of 15 units per acre. 20% of the district and units must be zoned within that half-mile station area. That means about 73 units need to be zoned in there and 4.8 acres. The remaining acreage and units can be located anywhere within the community. This is a map of the developable station area as defined by the state. So the state's, I know there's a lot more than 111 acres in here, but the state's designated certain areas as excluded from being counted. They are wetlands, designated open space, Title V areas, and public land. The remainder of that is what makes up the 111 acres. So part of this, I'm going to talk a little bit about zoning. Part of the compliance is a revision to our zoning bylaws that will allow for multifamily by right in certain areas. This does not allow developers to bypass all of our zoning regulations. We can create a zoning bylaw that can include restrictions on certain things. So we can impose an affordability component up to 10%. We're not required to, but we can, in order to keep our SHI numbers level. The town can impose dimensional requirements such as setbacks, building height, density. The density cannot be less than 15 units per acre overall. That doesn't mean that everywhere has to have that kind of density. The density can fluctuate depending on how many acres you have. We can dictate minimum parking requirements. We can require site plan review, and all projects have to adhere to septic and conservation regulations. The town cannot impose restrictions on the age of occupants, the number of bedrooms, the size of bedrooms, or the number of occupants. Thank you. Next slide. So in order to be compliant Wenham will have to designate certain areas as MBTA communities based on the numbers that have been determined by the state. We also have to develop a zoning bylaw for that area to allow multifamily by right with specific density and other dimensional affordability and use requirements. The things that need to be determined when drafting a zoning bylaw are things like lot size, setbacks, do we want to require an open space requirement, number of parking spaces, building height, maximum lot coverage, floor area ratio, do we want to require additional lot square footage per dwelling unit, do we want to require affordable units, and the state now allows for mixed-use development. We can require a mixed-use development. All of these changes will need to be taken to the town meeting for a vote before December 2024 to be compliant. So in order to amend a zoning bylaw, there are a few steps that need to be taken. You have to draft the bylaws, and the planning board will hold public hearings to get feedback on these zoning amendments. Then it has to be submitted to the select board for inclusion on the town meeting warrant, and the amendment has to be submitted at an annual or special town meeting. Our deadline, again, is December 2024. Great. So in February, this is a little bit about our technical assistance. In February this year, the planning board created a working group, and then the town applied for and received a technical assistance grant from Mass Housing Partnership for $10,000. Mass Housing Partnership set us up with J.M. Goldson. J.M. Goldson is also doing our master plan right now. But they're one of the organizations that the state trained and allows to give technical assistance on this topic. In the first round of technical assistance, the consultants were able to give us an understanding of the regulation and provide us with numbers and scenarios, but it didn't include any public participation or outreach. Since that first round, the state has heard back from many communities asking for more help. They've extended that assistance to allow communities that have already gotten technical assistance to apply for further funding. We have not applied for more assistance yet, but that's being discussed. So the technical assistance resulted in 4 scenarios. We received the 4 scenarios from the consultant, and we put together one additional based on information we received using the compliance model tool that the state has released. This is basically a spreadsheet where we can input data about specific sites and requirements, and it will tell us whether that input will result in a compliant district. The final decision, though, will be up to the state once we submit a final district and bylaw. So each of the following scenarios has been determined to be compliant. Wenham needs to decide if any of these scenarios are right for Wenham, or do we want to come up with an alternative. So these scenarios, some show more area, some show less area, because different land area could result in different density requirements. And the more land you designate, the less your density would be per acre. So the working group and the consultant are considering 4 parcels, basically, that when put together in different, that some of those parcels are town-owned, another one is owned by Oak Forest Farm LLC, and Brady Development Corporation owns another one. 100 Larch Lane is the small blue parcel up there. That's owned by the Haverhill Gas Company and Essex County Gas Company. The Wenham Housing Authority is the large green parcel, and that's owned by the Wenham Housing Authority. And 0 Walnut Road is the orange one. That's owned by a group called Hamilton Wenham LLC and SSG Commercial LLC. So each of the following scenarios involves only these parcels in different configurations. Scenario 1. Scenario 1 involves 3 districts. District 1 is that Walnut Road and Larch Lane site. So the 2 smaller parcels, they add up to 6.3 acres. And then District 2, this includes also the Housing Authority site, which is 26.27 acres, and it includes the Boulder Lane site. So this first scenario actually includes all of these sites. It zones for a lot more land area than is required, but it offers the least amount of density. Scenario 2 involves just 2 districts, And this is all within that half mile. It's the Walnut Road area and Lodge Lane. We tended to combine those two together because in the two of those, they make up over the 20% that we need to include within the half mile. And the Housing Authority site. The state determined that Housing Authority sites are eligible. Most town-owned land is not eligible, depending on its use. So this scenario provides compliance entirely within the station area. It maximizes opportunities to reduce vehicle trips to the transit station. It has a higher density than if we utilize Boulder Lane. Scenario 3. This involves 2 districts also. This is the Walnut Road area and Larch Lane, the 2 smaller parcels, and the Boulder Lane area. The higher density was required for the Walnut Road parcels in order to meet the minimum multifamily unit capacity, but this allowed a lower density at Boulder Lane to achieve that overall minimum average of 15 dwelling units per acre. I imagine I've lost some of you so far. This does get a little wonky. Scenario 4 involves 2 districts, the Housing Authority site, Larch Lane, and the Boulder Lane site. So that's just the Housing Authority and Boulder Lane. That significantly exceeds minimum requirements, but again, it allows for a lower density. Scenario 5 is just the one Housing Authority site. This has the highest density, roughly about 24 units per acre. But it's all within the half mile of the train station. So that's pretty much what we've learned thus far. This is my information, my contact information. The presentation will be available if anybody wants it on our website. But I've also included some links to other organizations within the state that are more than willing to answer questions if anybody has any. So thank you for allowing me to present to you. We do welcome your questions, and we just ask that let us know your name and address. And we have a sign-up sheet in case you want more information, and you can contact us. Any questions that we can't answer tonight, we'll take down and we will get back to you on them. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil.
I wonder if you would mind if you have questions coming up to the podium. That way the public can hear the questions also. We'll be able to answer on the microphones.
Thank you, Margaret. Ernest Ashley, 9 Foster Street. Couple of questions. I guess the Boulder Lane seems like it's a little ways away from MBTA, so could you speak to that lot? And then otherwise, the Housing Authority, which looks like an ideal situation, but it's been, I guess it's a dated property, and what would be entailed in having to use that property? So Boulder Lane and the Housing Authority property. Thank you.
Do you want to take it?
Sure.
Okay.
So you're right, Boulder Lane is not within the half mile of the station area. So the minimum requirements for us to meet for this is really 20% within the station area. So that, which means we need to have at least 4.8 contiguous acres and 73 units. And then we can place the rest anywhere else in town. So one of the things we're weighing is how much development or density do you want within a half mile of the station area, this is an ongoing discussion, and we'd love to hear your feedback on this. So one of those scenarios, if you use only, for example, the Walnut and Larch parcels, which is 6.3 acres, that would satisfy the requirements for the station area. You'd have to put 73 units there, so the density would be about 12 units per acre, and then you could place the remainder anywhere else. So again, there's a little bit of tension as to how much do we want to zone right within the station area and how much do we want to spread out to other parts of the town. Boulder Lane was identified in the feasibility study, I'm not sure when it was, but that it's best use would be multi-unit housing,
Yeah.
right? Right, so, okay.
Yeah, that's one of the best uses.
Yeah, so did that, and the other part of your question was about the housing authority site itself?
Is there a challenge in terms of changing the use or maybe making it mixed use? But it's, I guess it's right now elderly housing in some respects.
It is, yeah. I think one of the challenges with using the Housing Authority site is that those units count on our SHI. They're one of the main drivers of our subsidized housing inventory, which gets us over that 10% for affordable units. It's unclear what would happen and if the Housing Authority could sell off that property and to a developer which would have no the 10% affordability restriction, or what would happen with that. So I don't have a specific answer because there's been no examples yet of housing authorities transferring property to private ownership. Does that answer your question? It's not whether it's available. If we were to zone that area for this, it would be up to the housing authority as to what they decided to do with the property. As any place that we zone, or even your own properties are zoned for residential, you have the choice of what kind of buildings you put there. So the housing authority could, I imagine, sell it off to a private developer, and they could then build whatever designation we give it. But yeah, the housing authority properties are a little bit unclear.
So one other point we haven't mentioned that has come up in the guidelines is our consultant has told us that the state will not allow us to split lots. So if we choose the housing authority site, we'd have to choose all 26 acres of it. We couldn't say we're zone only 10 of it or something like that. We are looking further into that. A lot of this stuff is gray area still with the guidelines, and I don't think there are official regulations, right? They're just DHCD
They're
guidelines.
DHCD guidelines, yeah.
So that's another consideration that we have to weigh for each of these parcels. Now, Boulder Lane, however, has multiple lots, so we wouldn't, I think this is right, we wouldn't necessarily have to use all of those lots, right?
No,
okay.
there are multiple lots. We could just zone certain lots. Even though Boulder Lane has town-owned property, we did check with the state, because most town-owned land is excluded. But we checked with the state, and they said if there's information that the town may be wanting to sell that property for development, they would probably count it for us. So.
Phil Colorusso, 14 Juniper. I'm sorry if I missed this, if you said this in your presentation. You said there's no limitations, you can't limit the size of bedrooms, but for the calculations, what is the size per unit? And is there a limitation on how high you can build?
That's what the town would have to determine. We wouldn't be able to limit the size of the units, but we could regulate the height of the buildings.
Hi, Angus West, Walnut Road. I think I've asked before this, but, first a comment. I think we want to be very careful when we say that the town is not committing to build anything, and this is just a zoning exercise, to acknowledge that when you have 15 units per acre versus 1, the economics of the long-term development of this zone district is going to inevitably lead to this construction, which is what the state wants. And not to lose sight of this, they want us to add 25% to the housing stock of a small town. And trying to understand the economics of what this would mean to us over the next decade or 20 years worries me, in that the stress on our school system in particular, and what that would cost us, and public safety and the rest, against the purported lost benefits that we're getting. Because this is the state coming in and telling local zoning that we cannot follow our own zoning rules, and we're going to lose benefits. Now, the 3 main ones you mentioned, we don't even take advantage of. So have we done a little cost-benefit analysis to say, of those other programs that they have threatened that they will take into consideration, even though they don't have any statutory authority, what would we actually be giving up if we told the state, frankly, get lost? We like the town of Wenham the way it has been. We fought hard to keep it the way it is. And I'm not, by the way, completely ruling this out, but at least I'd like to know for the town, what's the trade-off? What would it cost if we added 365 units? That means like 700 people to the town, at least. What would that cost us over time? And what would we be giving up if we walked away from these programs that supposedly the state has?
I'm going to let Margaret answer the
Okay.
program part of this, but the first thing we would be facing would most likely be a lawsuit from the Attorney General. She's made it very clear recently that she intends to enforce the statute, and any towns that don't comply would most likely be facing litigation. So that's right. That, yes. So the statute mentions the first three, is it?
Yes.
Yeah, the statute mentions the first three funding programs.
Yeah.
Now, the list that Margaret put up, I'll let Margaret speak to that, of the additional programs.
So I have to say, no, we have not done a cost-benefit analysis. We've looked at this as, this is a state requirement, and how do we try to adhere to it? So far, several communities in Massachusetts have already complied. Many are just on the fence. They're just waiting to see what happens. We don't know of any current litigation from communities suing the state over this, but there is one organization, it's a housing organization, that's actually suing a community that is not adhering to it, that has not complied. So I can't really say that we know whether it's worth it to Wenham to just not do this, because nobody has just not done it yet. But I'm sure at some point litigation will start. And again, as Dan said, the Attorney General is serious about this. We have asked Town Council a little bit, but they're kind of standing on the fence too. I think they're waiting to see how it plays out a little bit more in other communities that they deal with. Town Council hasn't come forward with any real suggestions as yet. And again, we're just, not just getting started, but, you know, we're just getting input.
We've been going since February, right? Looking at this. But we haven't done a formal cost benefit, but let me address one of the points that you raised about the 365 units and the comments at the beginning that this is a zoning exercise. Practically speaking, it is highly unlikely that anybody's going to be able to build all 365 units, right? Because when I say it's a zoning exercise, we have to create a zoning district, but there's all sorts of other things that come into play with an actual development, whether that's septic, whether that's other infrastructure, whether it's topography of some of the lots. So, yes, we would have to zone for this number, but do we think that somebody would actually build out all of those units? Probably not. And feel free to weigh in, other members.
Hi, I'm Steve. I live out on Maple Street, and I'm not asking a question because a fine gentleman asked my question, but I will say that for me to vote for anything and approve it, I do need to see exactly how much those things in the red are costing me. And if I have to pay $10 a month more in my taxes, I'll pay it, right? And I don't think it's great here in Massachusetts, the cradle of liberty and this and that we just say, hey, the state told us we have to do it, so therefore we have to do it. I think it's crazy. We have to ask ourselves what's good for us. What do we want? And what's it going to cost us, right? So you're right. Things have to perk, and all has to work before you can actually build. But behind my house, not quite behind it, very, very close to the swamp, they went ahead and put in, I guess somebody approved them, an extra special septic system, an extra special this, extra special that. So we used to have a very nice swamp behind us, but now we have multi-use, high-density housing behind us. More traffic's gonna come onto my street. Street's either gonna have to get wider, or it's gonna be more problematic for me. And it's real, right? If you zone it, there's a developer there that's gonna see dollar signs, and they're gonna build it. Thanks.
So my name's Alex Schmidt, I live on Main Street. Just kind of following up on that, have we thought about how this works in conjunction with Hamilton? So for example, with the school systems, we're very tied. And if you add the 700 people in, how does that affect Bucher, Cutler? What's going on there? What about parking? If the parking is further away, if it's at the Boulder Lane, so commuters are gonna now park here in Hamilton, does that affect that parking? What does it, the traffic studies, how does that affect? I mean, coming out on Main Street these days, it's almost like it's rush hour all the time. Or, I mean, there's a lot of traffic. So what happens with all of that depending on this? Are there traffic studies that can help identify and understand, what the costs and the benefits are of all of this?
So we haven't had any formal meetings with Hamilton. Hamilton is, I think it's safe to say, much further behind in this process than we are.
But they also don't they have to come up with like 1,000 units?
Well, so that's what I was just about to tell you. So
Yeah.
within the, Hamilton's numbers are 731 total units.
Okay.
And I think 48 acres total. So they would need to put 12, an area of, a district of 12 acres within the half mile and zoned for 183 or so units. So you put that on top of Wenham and you've got,
Well, I mean, imagine if
250
everybody's all within that half mile, they
right,
don't max it out, but all of a sudden the traffic that's gonna be running through here is, it's gonna be a disaster, potentially.
yes. So, I mean, early in this process, we asked if we could get some kind of special treatment because we effectively have 2 towns doing this,
Right.
and we don't have a full half-mile,
Yeah, the whole radius.
diameter. Our radius is basically cut in half. So, I think the answer we got was no. We would not get any special treatment, and both towns need to do this. So, yes, you're correct in conjunction, it's over 250 units within that half-mile station area.
And that no is a hard no? I mean, I think, like, can we appeal that? I mean,
Yeah.
it doesn't make a lot of sense.
Right.
If we're comparing ourselves to Milton, to all these other towns that you've seen in the globe that are like, whoa, we don't want this, we might get rid of the
Yeah.
rail or whatever.
Train station.
It's not an equal assessment, if you will. So,
I don't know if there's a formal appeal process or an application for this. I suspect what would happen is that the state would treat us as kind of one, even though we're 2 towns, as one station and sort of one town with the combined numbers. They'd look at our housing stock, and that's how they derive all the numbers, right? Which is from the housing stock and the developable acreage within. So I don't know what the answer would be, but it wouldn't surprise me if that's what it was.
I think that right now, again, this is new, and most communities in Massachusetts haven't really gotten through this process. These are a lot of questions that I think will be coming up, because some communities will say, why do we have to have that number? Or, we think there's more wetlands here than you're telling us. So the state's just kind of dropped this on us, and that's why we're starting to have the discussion.
You mentioned that we have Leo Maestranzi on Larch Row. You mentioned that we have 111 acres within a half a mile. Would the requirements be different if we had 99 acres?
Yes, they would be.
Would we required 365 units because we have over 100 acres?
Yes, the numbers are based on our developable station area.
And what would the requirements be if we had less than 100 acres?
I want to say it's maybe less than 100.
Less than a third of the units.
I believe
I
so, but
see.
I don't have those
Yeah.
numbers in front of me right now.
Somebody mentioned that 365 units might add 700 to the population of the town, and it might. It could add 1,400 or even more. So that would add 20% to the population, and to the demand on the school budget and the safety budget and the public works budget, and I wonder if it would add 20% to the revenue.
So,
Thank you.
yeah, we did contact the state and ask them, I'm sorry, Kate, can you bring up the map that shows the developable station area? Yeah, so if you see the area in tan with the red buildings, that's considered our developable station area. That's our 111 acres. Because we have 111 acres, that's why we're a commuter rail community. If we had less than 100 acres, we would be considered an adjacent community. I think that, so we would have lesser requirements. If you're a small town, you can zone for fewer units. So I asked the state, what if, say, 12 acres in this suddenly became excluded? How could it be excluded? Would that drop us down? The CPC could buy it. You'd have to find the land and purchase it. They weren't really willing to discuss that. They said, we're going by what we've got now. These are the maps that we've given you. All of their maps and their layers are based on information and data that we provided through our GIS, through our assessor's office, and through the state wetlands layers. These layers haven't been delineated. The wetlands haven't been delineated. We don't know for sure that these maps are all 100% accurate. But again, they did not want to discuss that, and they said, we're basing it on what we know right now. There has been discussion of what if the town were to purchase, 15 or 20 acres. Would that change our classification? And it could. I don't think anyone else has broached that subject, because out of the whole 177 communities, Wenham is about the only one where that's probably viable, because most other of the communities have a lot more than 100. They're at 200. They're way higher than us. So that small amount, it was an idea that was brought up by someone that we know, and it wasn't a terrible idea, but I don't know that it's viable under the state right now.
Well, you can look on that map, sorry to just interrupt. You can look on that map and identify properties that there's an acre here, an acre there, that it's not accessible to any roads. You'd have to go through somebody else's yard or something, which would mean you'd have to either buy it, eminent domain, however you get it, that ought to not be included, I would argue, because it's not really developable for this use. It's not the right size, but it's also not accessible. And there's no sewer, there's no infrastructure to support it. So why would that area be included? Or can we get it excluded?
So that goes back to the zoning exercise part of this, that it's not, we're not necessarily creating a district that these things have to be built, or it might even be likely that they're all built. That is a practical development question, just like septic, just like water and other infrastructure. So, but we're not required to do that. We're required to create a zoning district.
Margaret, are these 4 scenarios finalized, or do we have the potential to go back to the drawing board and potentially do other scenarios as well? I think we can do that.
No, nothing is finalized.
Right.
We've just finished our work with the consultant, and we wanted to bring this information to the community.
No.
Right.
So one of the reasons for having this session tonight was to start this discussion exactly. We've been working on this in a small group for a while, and no, these scenarios are not final. But we want you all and other people in town to engage in this process so we can be better informed as we're moving forward through this. I know most of the comments tonight seem to be coming down on one side of this issue. There are people on the other side of the issue too, and if you're here, please, speak up if you like. But we need this kind of feedback. And I'm not saying I'm coming down on one side of this issue or another, but that's what this process is meant for.
Jim Purdy, Larch Row. Would any of these units, once they were built, generate revenue? Are these taxable units predicated on our current tax rate and so on?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
All taxable.
And so, would there be incorporated in the study an economic plan? That was raised by, I think, someone else here too. An economic plan of what do we get back from this and what is it going to cost the community to try to begin to address budgetary issues? Thank you.
And that hasn't been done yet. We haven't really gotten that far.
Will it be done as we go down this process over the next year?
I think it should be.
Yeah, I think we'd like it to be. So one of the things that we can do is these can be mixed use now. So, for example, one of these areas is pretty close to the strip mall, but it's behind
Crosby's. Yeah.
Right?
CVS.
So you could have, mixed-use development with additional retail, whether that's retail or restaurants or shops or whatever else, that would be generating some revenue for the town.
But with the housing units would also generate revenue as well.
Yes, they're all going to be taxed
Okay.
at a regular rate. Ernest just pointed out, the master plan committee is doing some work right now on economic development, and
There's
we
a
have some
series of strategies for goals, but certainly one of the major themes that had been listened to by the master plan is what do we do about taxes, and how much can we improve the tax base through some type of development. And so obviously this comes at the same time where we're dealing with the MBTA. There was a Cambridge economics study that said, we have such a small amount of commercial space that it would take what we probably would not find acceptable, like 33 equivalent of CVS's to lower our tax rate by like 3%. So we said, no, that's probably not what's right for Wenham. But at the same time, they looked at the amount of density that would occur if there was development around, say, the MBTA train station, multi-use type of facilities versus just residential properties, and how much does that change? So it's not going to make a dramatic change in the tax base, but as you just alluded to, more density and maybe mixed-use development would have a potential positive impact on the tax revenues. But as someone else said, we'd also have a number of students going into the schools. So it's definitely a balancing act. But there's been some study to that effect.
Being creative, if I'm going to have to do this new thing, right now our tax rates seem to be sort of based on how big the property is. Why don't we quadruple or maybe go up by a factor of 10? Within this area, this zoning area, we're going to tax it at 10 or 20 times the rate that we tax everybody else. Are we allowed to kind of put together rules and laws about that? So if somebody wants to build that, they're just going to have to pay the tax.
Yeah, I'm not sure really what we could do about how we could tax these differently, but Steve, would you mind speaking into a microphone just so you can even sit with Rich or something? Thank you.
As a Chapter 59 of Mass General Laws dictates our ad valorem taxation, and we've adopted a uniform tax rate, and it's driven off of market values of the property. So unless those properties were worth 10 times their neighbors, that's the only way you could tax them. Like that.
In case anyone doesn't know, this is Steve Poulos, our town administrator.
Margaret, I don't know if you know the answer to this question. So the wetlands that are mapped here, I'm assuming that's from the state wetlands map?
It is, Phil, yeah.
And so, as you know, Wenham wetlands tend to be larger than what state delineation is. Is it worth looking at that within this area? I mean, I don't think it's going to change by 12 acres, but
Yeah. Well,
and Dan, just so you know, I am. My wife told me I have to buy my daughter and her husband a house, and so I am for some additional housing units in town,
She
so I can
wants.
retire.
So the maps that the state has given us, honestly, we've looked at them and we're not sure they're 100% accurate. I don't believe anyone's gotten to that point where we were challenging the maps, but it might be something to consider.
Art Kennedy, 20 William Fairfield Drive. We've lived here 5 months.
Oh.
That's it.
Welcome to town.
Yeah, so it's all new to us. But we did move here because there were a lot of high-density housing. We love that the carpet rolls up at 8 o'clock at night. That's another reason we live. Well, we're on 2 acres, so we have a lot of privacy in the forest out there. But I am one of those evil developers. It's what I do. I don't do it in Massachusetts. I do it in Florida and Texas and Arizona. We live here to be near family. So I know exactly how the developer thinks of what you're preparing. I can help make it unattractive to a developer, but if you go too far, then the state attorney general can come after you for doing something malicious or veiled. But if you didn't want this to happen, I thought of 3 ways to stop it. 1, get rid of the rail stop, close it. That's what's driving this demand. We wouldn't have a rail stop anymore in Hamilton. Wouldn't bother me much, but it would bother some people who use it to go to work. And then make the zoning, well, somebody suggested earlier, tell the state to buzz off or sue us. We're not going to do it. 3rd, make the zoning reasonable but so restrictive that a developer couldn't execute what we're talking about. And there are ways of, because when I go to other communities in Texas and Arizona, they have banned multifamily housing, and I still get it built. We come in at different angles. So somebody will think of a way to do it, but if the zoning is strong, the message is don't build in Wenham if you're doing multifamily. Affordable housing is different. That brings in grant money and other people paying for it. Attainable is just building inexpensively. And I do a lot of that in Texas. The jobs that we have here, there are probably a lot of jobs just in nearby communities where these younger people need a place to live. They don't have a down payment. They can't afford the interest rates. So there's some demand for it for sure. But none of these sites you've mentioned are attractive to me in my developer mind. I look at all of them and say, I would not tackle any of those. Our parking requirement is 2 per bedroom. That's the kiss of death for multifamily. We try to get 0.75 per bedroom because parking is expensive to build and it requires more land. So for 365 units, I would need about 13 acres to do that. That's dense, it's 5-story, it's surface parked. That's what you'd have. It's unattractive, it's an eyesore in Wenham, and I hope we don't get to that point. But anyway, my point is, if you were against it, I don't know what the town's feeling is, the sense is. We gotta have a mandate or a vote or a official position from the city that we're not in favor of this, we don't like it, but we're gonna comply. We can do that in a certain way that we're careful about it. Or if we are in favor of it, are the people in favor of it? I haven't heard one yet tonight, but I appreciate the work you guys are doing. You're navigating a requirement that's It's just a dream somebody just imposed on us. It doesn't fit in Wenham very well. So I hear you saying we're trying to comply with the requirement. I don't know if the people of Wenham want you to comply with it, because we can say no more stop or go ahead. We don't need that grant money. We don't want it. And I have been watching what's happening in other communities around the rail area. A lot of people are against this. They're all trying to figure it out, but they have like thousands of units they have to put in. We don't have very many. So we could probably tailor the zoning that still conform, but make it unattractive to a developer. And I think that's what I would lean towards, not pick a fight with the state attorney general. So anyway, thanks.
On those are a little quiet.
Let me check.
Yeah, so thank you for those comments, and I want to say that we've had a number of meetings about this to date at the planning board, and there are going to be more. So come to our planning board meetings and air your opinions and let us know what you think about this.
Yeah, hi, Dan Beckman, Main Street. Can you talk a little bit about Boulder Lane and sort of how development thoughts are on that, either as part of this or the overall town plan? I served on a study commission maybe 15 years ago, and there were a lot of ideas, and like all of them were impractical. And I'm just wondering sort of how practical this is, or whether it was selected for its impracticality.
I'm going to let you take this one.
The land's
There you go.
challenged. It's a number of different lots. Different people own it. It's got a lot of wetland there, so it's going to be a challenge to build there.
So we did do a Boulder Lane feasibility study. It was prior to my getting here, so I think it was like 2014, maybe 2015. And there are challenges there. It's called Boulder Lane for a reason. There's a lot of ledge, there's wetlands. There is some developable area, but as Peter mentioned, it has different ownership. The other challenges down there are water. Our town water doesn't go that far. Gordon College, Parsons Hill, those are all on Salem Beverly Water Board water. So we're not saying that it's easily developable, but we're saying if it was zoned for that and a developer had the wherewithal to do it, it could be done. But
I just want to add something about the scenarios and the numbers that the consultant ran for us for these particular scenarios. All of them exceeded what our minimum requirements were. Okay, so they were far in excess of our 365 and
yeah,
24 acres. So we are still looking at these scenarios and we have the compliance tool to adjust this to see, can we get things closer to what our minimum numbers really are. So that's just a point I wanted to clarify.
sorry, I didn't hear.
Have we audited the tool?
Have we audited the tool itself?
Yeah. It's their tool, they made it.
They did make it, and they made it hard. It's, we didn't approach it with that thought. The consultants, again, were trained by the state. I actually did take some of the training courses to try to understand some of this, but we didn't go at it with that idea, so.
Well, I do medical device development. I can't use a spreadsheet to add 2 + 2 unless I validate that spreadsheet.
Yeah, I would think the state.
Yeah, it's mostly going to be just mathematical, right? The key here is applying is applying that minimum gross density, so, across the whole thing. So, for example, I think scenario 1 had all 3 of those parcels, right?
Did.
So that's 26 plus 31 plus another 6, that's over 63 acres, where we only need to zone for 24. So, you know, a couple of the other scenarios come closer. The difficulty is coming up with the 4.8 acres within the half mile, because it has to be contiguous. So that's why that's why those 2 lots were selected. Those combined, those give us 6.3 acres, which is, I think, as close as we can get to 4.8.
Yeah. And one of those lots is owned by the gas company, because there's a gas pump, or I believe, on it. And we saw that, and we said, that seems like it should be excluded on the map, but it's not. The state didn't exclude it, so we included it. And if, you know, we're gonna go by what they say, we'll be able to use that lot. Whether it's developable or not, I don't know. Huh? Would you mind coming up? It's just hard for us to hear, Angus.
We're looking at half a pie. We're looking at half
Yes.
a pie, and many of us who live in the area wonder what the heck Hamilton is thinking about. I must admit, I love now the Boulders idea, being on 128 and unbuildable. So it seems to satisfy your suggestion. That seems better and better to me. But do we have any idea what Hamilton would like to do, which is going to have just as big an impact on our lives, really, as what we do with Wenham?
So I watched one of the Hamilton Planning Board's meetings from, I think, about a month ago or so, where they talked about this, and they had a presentation from one of their attorneys. They're just beginning the process, was my read of watching that meeting. There was a lot of resistance, I would say, to the legislation. There's a lot of discussion about potential challenges by other towns. We've looked into that. We haven't really seen any of that yet. We're not, I mean, we do have questions out to our town council as well. But they seem to be approaching, I don't want to speak for them, so their meeting is available on YouTube. You can watch it yourself. But I think they were looking at this sort of like, well, we're in a master planning process, and that will cover it. And we have I think this is a fair assessment. They said they already have a commercial district in which there is no zoning restriction on number of units, so wouldn't that count? So I'd leave that to them and their council.
I think it's important to know, too, that I believe this would have to go before town meeting as well. So whatever happens there happens, but I believe the state would look at that and say that at least we're working toward fulfilling the requirements. Just something to keep in mind. This will have to go before a town meeting vote, special town, well, either a town meeting or a special town meeting.
Hi, Catherine Harrison, 49 Pleasant Street. An area that I think I'd like to understand more, and I don't think we do yet, is the housing authority. The housing authority land.
Yes.
I think I heard you say that it has not been excluded, so it has
Right.
been included, and yet, as you said, it's a large percentage of our SHI. So if for those folks that want to make it more difficult to build, including that is probably a good thing. Is it town-owned land or state-owned land?
I'm not sure, Catherine. Do you know?
Owned by the Housing Authority,
It's
which is
own-
a
yeah.
state, a governmental agency. Right.
Are they, I don't know if they're a state entity. It's a town entity.
Town entity. So the town actually owns the land, and it's run by a state. Okay. So that's just,
Yeah.
just something I think I'd like to understand more about. I think there are a lot of things that
Yeah, we can do
all need
more
to
research
understand
on that.
more about, but that one I'm a little protective of the SHI, I guess.
So I think, Ben, do you have something to add on this point? It's Ben Timon, one of our select board members.
Thanks, Stan. Yeah, with respect to the Housing Authority land, so it is, we checked the deed, it is owned by, the Town Housing Authority. Its future is controlled by the elected members of the Town Housing Authority. So, where you have some of these other parcels that are privately owned, where, as several people have said already, if the zoning comes in and allows, fairly dense allowances for zoning, there's certainly an economic incentive on the part of owners eventually to try to, sell that to a developer. That is not necessarily the case with a publicly owned parcel. As Margaret mentioned, I mean, certainly the Housing Authority could sell that land to a private developer, but it's probably just as likely that, there could be more control on the part of the town and the townspeople with respect to what would actually get built there. So you could have a scenario, and who knows, there's so many factors that could come into play, but a scenario where the Housing Authority lot is included within this MBTA community's zoning, maybe even at a relatively high density, but the Housing Authority as an owner may enter into some kind of a development agreement with a developer to build something much less dense, and as the owner would have the ability to, to control that. And so maybe it's ends up being, a sale that's contingent upon certain conditions that the owner would impose that are actually more stringent than what the zoning might allow. So I don't see that necessarily as a silver bullet because there are so many variables to that, but I think that is a discriminator between the Housing Authority parcel and some of these other parcels. And then, as several people have said, a discriminator with respect to Boulder Lane is that it may be very difficult to build there. So that may also be a practical impediment to zoning, or practical impediment to building it to the fullest extent of what zoning might allow. I would just say too that I don't want to have people's expectations set improperly with respect to the compliance question. And I'm just one member of a 5-member select board, but I certainly would not support an effort to try to thwart compliance with the law. I think you have a lot of experienced people who have been involved in this for quite some time. Dan is like myself, is a land use litigator, and we deal with these issues all across the state. Margaret has a ton of experience with this, Kate, and a lot of people who have been involved in this are very well versed in dealing with zoning rules. As one select board member, like I said, I'm not at all inclined to try to find a way not to comply with the law, and I'd be surprised if the boards who are controlling this process, the planning board, the select board to some extent, if that sentiment actually would have much purchase on those boards. So for better or for worse, for those of you who may have a different view.
Any other questions? Great. Leo?
I'd like to ask the gentleman how he would show that the 365 units would be beneficial to the town.
If you would like to ask a developer?
The gentleman that just spoke here, the selectman that just
Oh, Ben? Sure.
Could you explain, show us how 365 units would be beneficial socially, economically, or in any way?
Yeah, well, I think, I don't think that 365 units is actually the right way to think about it, because we are just talking about zoning, and we're talking about, and again, I haven't been involved in depth in this process, so I defer to the folks who really have had their, gotten their hands dirty on this. But, we're trying to do this in a smart way, Mr. Mastronzi, where there won't actually be as many units as are permitted by zoning. But in my personal view, I think that there are infill opportunities near the center of town, which include, where the Housing Authority site is, given that mixed use is allowed. If there were a modestly sized mixed use development put near the train station, including on the Housing Authority parcel, if there's developable land left there that wouldn't jeopardize the existing units, I think there's a lot of benefits that could come from that type of modestly sized development. Greater diversity, greater housing opportunities, but in a way that doesn't overwhelm the town. There's a lot of things that have to go right to make that happen. But I think that's why we're engaged in this, process, trying to figure out a smart way to be able to comply.
You mentioned not to try to thwart
Right.
in any way. With trying to reduce it to 100 units instead of 365.
Yeah. Right. No, and that's yeah. No, and that right. No, I don't think that that's trying to thwart it.
365 be more beneficial than 100 units.
I think that if, and I've had the conversation about that specific issue with someone that you know well, who I think studied it pretty closely. And as Margaret said, I mean, if there's a way that the state would look at that, then yeah, I mean, absolutely, we should think about that. But first of all,
365 or 100?
no, if we were able to reduce the acreage to below 100, and the state, was willing to take a fresh look at that, I see no reason.
That would be better 100 instead of 365.
That would.
Socially, economically, and so forth.
Yes, I would agree with that. Yeah, but is it achievable? So that's a question. What are we gonna, if we can? We're right. Well, so that's something that should be looked at, and whether those 11 acres or 12 acres can be.
And we do have questions out to town council about this. It's not as straightforward a question as it appears, though, because there's nothing to say that the state won't turn around and say, that's great, that now you have 99 acres, but we made our determination when you had 111 and it's not fluid, so you're still on the hook for 365. So, I mean, I think it's safe to say that the state is pushing for this legislation to be enforced, or at least carried out in good faith. Now, I agree, I think it's highly unlikely that 365 units would ever be built. I understand what as of right zoning means, however, and that means they don't have to come to us for a special permit, but we did have a discussion at one of our board meetings about, what would it look like if we had, 75 units within the station area, and what would that mean for the vibrancy of the downtown area? What if we had more restaurants, more foot traffic, more people taking the train? So that falls on sort of the other side of the issue from most of what we've heard tonight, but that is, another side of the issue, and I think Mr. Colarusso said that we do need some additional housing supply in town. So, yeah, those are factors that we're considering.
So we have actually been looking at the costs associated with different types of housing. If we were to build a subdivision, typically like is on Spring Hill subdivision, those properties actually cost the town approximately $12,000 a year, because those are typically families with 3, 4 children. The kind of development that they're talking about here brings in, and people don't believe this, but it brings in very few children. These types of communities are mostly apartment buildings. Therefore, I think from a developer's perspective, they're more interested in 1 and 2 bedroom apartments. I think they're more financially viable for a builder. So this is a question that's always brought up with 40B debate, and numerous studies have shown that apartment developments do not bring many children at all. And there's lots of studies to back that up. But people don't, it doesn't really sound good. You're like, oh, we're gonna have all these more people, they're gonna bring kids. But typically, subdivisions bring the most amount of children. Apartment developments don't typically. But we may have some numbers on multifamily buildings and what kind of revenue those produce. They produce a positive income rather than a negative, as a subdivision would bring a negative income. But I can get those numbers. Okay.
Anybody else? Any other questions? No, you're putting your coat on. I thought you were raising your hand, Phil. You were putting your coat on, sorry. Well, thank you, everybody, for coming out tonight. And I hope we continue this process. I've mentioned a few times about planning board meetings. We'd love to, get your input during those meetings. We're also in the middle of a master plan process. There are MPAC meetings, which is Master Plan Advisory Committee, that I think people can weigh in on as well,
yep,
right?
Yep.
Okay.
They'll be in the town's calendar. The next planning board meeting is on December 14th, Thursday, I think, the 14th.
It's the second Thursday of every month.
Yeah, the second Thursday of every month. And the MBTA is going to be on the agenda probably pretty much every meeting, which is just one of those items we keep on so that they can continue to discuss it.
And so these two things, the master plan and MBTA, are moving forward at the same time. It's just we have more time pressure on the MBTA front because we have a deadline to comply by the end of 2024.
And Deanne, we're not anticipating bringing this to spring town meeting. We haven't finalized it enough. We're not ready. So we're not anticipating it being a town meeting next year. Possibly special town meeting in the fall, but we don't know for sure of that either. If we were to not bring it forward until our 2025 town meeting, I don't think the ramifications would be huge for us. I think the state will give us a little time, as long as they know we're working towards it. Well, thank you, everybody, for coming, and you have our contact information. You can contact us at Town Hall anytime. Send an email. And if you, I have a couple of questions that I'll be responding to.
It's not on the air, it's right there.
Anyone else?